everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of In With the Old. I'm Dr. Brian Koenig, and this is the podcast focused on dispelling myths, building appreciation for God's Word, and helping you rediscover the Old Testament for the life of faith. Today, we are finishing up and reaching the halfway point of the book of Ruth as we cover verses 14 through 23 and the end of chapter 2. I've got to say, Dr. Tim, this has been a fun series so far. We've had a lot of positive feedback, a lot of good interactions. And so I really think, and it's my hope, that this series has helped people just get a fresh appreciation for God's Word and how it applies to you. I threw it over to you already, but I haven't introduced you. I'm joined today by my co-host, as always, Dr. Tim. How are you doing? How have you felt the series has gone so far?
You know, I think it's gone really well. The book of Ruth has really captivated the mind and imagination of people from its writing. And part of it is because it's raw, it's real. It shows us the truest emotions of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, and yet through it we see God's faithfulness. So I hope it's been beneficial. It's a joy for us to present this to our listeners, and I'm looking forward to diving into the rest of chapter 2.
Absolutely. Well, I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to read for us from the Christian Standard Version, or the Christian Standard Bible, verses 14 through 23 of chapter 2. So feel free to follow along in your Bibles at home. At mealtime, Boaz told her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce." So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied and had some left over. When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain among the bundles and do not humiliate her. Pull out some of the stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her." So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and there was about 26 quarts of barley. She picked up the grain and went into the town where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today? And where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law whom she had worked with and said, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead." Naomi continued, "The man is a close relative. He's one of our family redeemers." Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of the harvest.'" So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants so that nothing will happen to you in another field." Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Beautiful ending to the halfway point of this book, kind of in some sense pulling together a lot of the narrative themes we've seen so far, but also it's not the end of the story, as we'll see in chapter 3. But Dr. Tim, last time we saw Ruth coming to the field of Boaz and doing so by chance or by luck. We'll come back to that theme a little bit today. But in this field, she meets Boaz, this mighty man who shows himself to be of the highest moral character. We kind of pick up where we left off last time. Still in the field, still working, still in that same day. As we look at the meal starting in verse 14, what do your eyes see, and where do you see the significance of this event?
Yeah, well, Brian, it's so beautiful when we see Boaz's generosity toward Ruth. It's astonishing that he allows her to remain in the field. He treats her, as we've discussed, as someone who's a relation to him, as someone who's part of his family. So he's already blown away all expectations, and in a sense has blown away all propriety in this situation. And yet we're going to see that continue. And the meal setting sort of switches the scene a little bit. We see now that Boaz sees Ruth, and apparently she's eating by herself. She's off, kind of isolated. But Boaz invites her in. He says, No. I called you my daughter, which means you are going to come and dine with me. And it's very possible that he recognized she probably didn't have any food, or if she had food, she had very little. And yet he invites her to come sit with him, dip what she had in the same sauce that they had. He invites her to come and sit next to him. He then serves her from the roasted grain. And so this is, in a sense, not just his physical provision of Ruth, but what just pops out to me is that he's treating her as a social equal. In fact, by serving her, what he actually does is again subvert the expectation so that the owner of the field now becomes a servant himself. And so there's a lot here to unpack, but I want us to look at verse 14, where it says again, Boaz told her, come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce. So she sat beside the harvesters and he offered her roasted grain. Brian, I see the honor coming out here, but what are some things that you see? What are some things that catch your eye at this meal?
Well, I see the expansive nature of what the author's trying to focus on with Boaz. At one level, you could say it was perfectly fine and magnanimous and great enough for him to say, oh, you can harvest in my field, you're safe. Like, this is great. And we could have stopped there and probably had a very positive view of Boaz.
Mm.
But we see here it going a step further. I'm not going to let social norms stand in the way of inviting you in. When I called you my daughter, when I placed you under protection, I'm not constraining myself to what might look proper on the outside or the bare minimum of generosity, right? We do see this kind of, as you already said, this is outside the bounds of what she would expect. She was not brazenly claiming this for herself, but Boaz invites her in. And Tim, I see in this too echoes of Jesus when he comes out and does not let social propriety and norms kind of stand in the way of inviting people in. When God breaks down barrier walls, he brings us all the way in. And we see that a bit in how Boaz treats Ruth. So that's kind of where my mind went, offering her food and an abundance of food, right? Listeners, if you followed along, she gets to go from this meal. She has so much food left over that she can give it to Naomi at the end of the day for immediate food, right? You don't have to bake the bread of what she's gathered. You have an immediate taking care of the needs. And so that's an important element as well. The gathering in the field is going to long term take care of their food needs, but this is taking care of the immediate need of hunger present in the moment. So it's a beautiful scene. I love that is added on. It just keeps exemplifying Boaz as a kinsman redeemer and as the type of person we are supposed to be.
Yeah, it totally does, Brian. And Boaz comes off really very humble in this text. He's the owner of the field. He does not have to be working among these day laborers, and yet he does. He comes and he dines with them. He invites Ruth to join him. He himself serves her. And it reminds me of the parable in the book of Luke. You mentioned Jesus, and I think of the same thing, that Luke says that in the kingdom of heaven, that Christ himself is going to take on the garb of a servant, and we're going to be seated at his table, and he is going to serve. And so we see this image here where Boaz has absolutely no obligation to Ruth whatsoever. And yet he humbles himself, he serves her, he gives her, in a sense, this excess portion to show and to demonstrate, I'm not just going to honor you as my daughter with my words, but I am going to serve you. It is a full circle reversal of the expectations. And Brian, you noted here in our notes that it's also just unusual to see the mixing of sexes here. Do you want to say maybe a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and again, we don't want to necessarily overread this, but this is a culture going up even until Jesus's time where it was traditionally segregated by the sexes. You'd have some intermingling, obviously you'd have to for courting, and then within the family unit, but as soon as you go into public culture, as it were, generally the men stay with the men, the women stay with the women. And so you see even that barrier being broken down. Again, we saw even last time in a little bit of their first interaction, there are hints of courting, of dating, of interest. I think you see the groundwork is being laid here. It's not explicit, but it's being laid for what we're going to see in chapter 3 and then in chapter 4. So just a little bit of an unusual element to the story. And I think it's going somewhere as well. So, Tim, as we move then in to Boaz, so we have the mealtime and that shifts back. Boaz has some more commands for
Mm.
his day laborers. We've already seen he said, let her work with the female workers and don't assault her, right? He's cared for her physical protection. But now Boaz continues to keep going further and further in his generosity. What are some of the new things he now tells his workers post meal?
Yeah, excellent, Brian. In verse 15 and 16, he takes the next step when he says, let her gather grain even among the bundles and don't humiliate her. Verse 16, pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her. And so we see here that Boaz seems to be taking on himself the responsibility for her physical provision, right? He puts her in the prime spot so that she's able to glean more and gather more. He commands his servants, hey, I want you to go ahead and intentionally leave some behind for her. And he tells them, don't humiliate her, don't rebuke her. And this may have been for a couple of reasons. It may have been that Boaz would have known that this kind of favor toward Ruth would have embittered his servants, that perhaps they would have looked at his favor and his kindness toward her and said, well, what is she doing to deserve this? And it also could be that he recognized their animosity toward her as a foreigner, or at least, if not animosity, potentially skepticism, that they would have looked at her and said, you don't deserve this. You're not worthy of this. At which point Boaz says up front, I want you guys to provide for her physically. I want you to treat her as my daughter, as an equal. He is essentially bestowing again his honor upon her and saying, I am going to protect you as someone who is a guest in my field, and I'm going to make sure you are provided for.
Yeah, that's
So,
a good point, Tim, because before Boaz has clearly stepped in and said, you are physically protected.
mhm,
His
mhm,
statement here to his workers to do not humiliate her definitely has more to do with things being said. It's no longer her physical protection, but now her protection as a person. Um, because let's just say ancient Israel, especially at this time, probably doesn't have the highest view of foreigners. If this
mhm.
is the time of the judges, who keeps coming in and oppressing Israel, right?
Yeah,
Well, it's the foreign nations around them. And so it makes sense to kind of step in a little bit and be like, don't harass her for that. I'm the one extending, Boaz, he says, right? I'm the one extending these favors to her. So respect that decision and respect my choice to give those things to her.
yeah, yeah. Boaz brings her under his protection, and also as we just consider the idea, not only is this a time when every man does what's right in his own eyes, there is no centralized government that you could appeal to, right? There
Hmm.
is no court that
There's no
Ruth could
king.
say, "Hey, I have been wronged." And so Boaz, as the owner of the field, as a leader in his community, it would have fallen on him, and he takes up the mantle. He does very well by Ruth. And we also see here, don't we, Brian, in verse 16, an interesting wordplay. As
Mm.
verse 16, Boaz tells his workers, pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. This is the same word that's used to describe Ruth leaving or forsaking her people and coming to Israel. And now Boaz says, leave the stalks for her. So maybe you can talk about the significance of this as the story continues to unfold, Brian.
Yeah, it's a beautiful kind of parallel in the reader's mind, right? Because as you're reading through in Hebrew, uh, so far Ruth had to leave, had to make a choice, right? My future is going to be dependent on what I do. Do I stay with my family or do I go with my mother-in-law? She leaves. She makes the trust and faith, right? I'm going to step out and I'm going to go with Naomi. She has come to this field at the beginning of the story looking for grace. She's had to step out again to care for herself and her mother in law. And we see this beautiful kind of little hint. Just as she left and did so as an act of faith, she is now receiving even more grace than she expected in this field because the workers are now leaving things for her that will care for her. It's just this beautiful imagery, isn't it, Tim, of, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, God's presence by being absent in the story. God isn't talked
Mm,
about a lot. God never speaks in the book of Ruth. And yet we see these beautiful little ties together that there is someone behind and through and in the story.
yeah.
And in verse 16, I mentioned, but I want to make sure we don't miss this, listeners. This, in verse 16, especially as she's received all these favors from Boaz, really sits as a beautiful counterpart to how the story began. She has arrived at a field randomly, hoping for a miracle, right? She needs extraordinary grace just to live, just for Naomi to live as well. She has received that, and she has received again and again more even than she could dream of. This bears itself out, moving ahead just a little bit to verse 17. She gets a haul. Now, Tim, growing up, I'd see things like ephahs, talents when you get to the New Testament. You see all
Yeah.
these units of measurement, and as a kid, I was always like, sure, whatever. What's that in freedom units? Because I need to know a little bit better.
Yeah.
Now, there is some, obviously, we don't know precisely. Hubbard, in his commentary on this book, and he wrote for the Nikot series,
Mhm.
he says an ephah is probably equivalent to a bath, and that would be a liquid measure, with an ephah being a dry measure. And we found those, and they contain approximately 5.8 gallons.
Mhm.
In dry measures, this would be a half to 2/3 of a bushel. This is probably at a minimum 29 to 30 pounds worth of grain. That is a huge amount of
Yeah.
grain, much more so, right, than you would expect to haul from a field as someone, especially as a forwarder, right, gleaning the corners of the field.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely it is. And just thinking about this, the debate about the measures is basically, was there a consistent measure through Israelites' history?
Yeah.
And so there's some debate about that, but by any stretch of the imagination, this was enormous. This was something that blessed Ruth, that blessed Naomi. 30 pounds, Brian. I saw some estimates that it could be even more than that, up to 50 pounds. So
Hmm.
much so, you almost get the sense that Boaz made sure that she had as much as she could possibly take with her. And we're going to see
Yeah.
that again in chapter 3 as he blesses her again in that way, saying, "Don't go to your mother in law empty handed," which is always a good rule of thumb. Boaz
That's a
was a
great rule
wise
of
man,
thumb.
was he not?
Gentlemen, mark that down. That is some
Yeah,
biblical wisdom for you. Um,
absolutely. Absolutely.
it, the amount of food she takes back, right, 30 pounds, 50 pounds, whatever, the point is very clear. This is a abundance, and I think it tells us two very important things, Tim.
Hmm.
First, it shows us the generosity of Boaz, right? He opened the door, not just a little bit, not just enough to maybe you'll glean enough to care for yourself for today, but
Hmm.
in those amounts, this has solved the food crisis for the foreseeable future for the two of
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
So it shows the generosity of Boaz. It also shows the industriousness of Ruth.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter if Boaz opens the door, does all these things, if she's just sitting there picking her nose or not right really engaged. We saw that Ruth is someone, I think we use the term hard-headed, not hard-headed, obstinate. Right, when she sets her mind to do something, she does it. We
Hmm.
see that here. When the door is open, she got to work and she was able to reap the benefits of Boaz's generosity. So
Yeah.
we see these two things, these characters we've been introduced, the person who commits and the person who's generous, both coming together to just give this rich blessing. And with that, she comes back to her mother in law, Naomi, in verse 18. And
Hmm.
so, Tim, what do we see as we transition from the field back into the village?
Yeah, it's an amazing scene because we get to see Naomi's jaw-dropping reaction. And just to pick up briefly on what you said, Brian, we see that she stayed in the field until evening. She was there for as long as she possibly could be, working hard. And again, just think of this. In our mind, we're so used to this idea of we know the end of the story, but Ruth, all she knows is that in a few hours, her life has fundamentally changed. She goes from not even knowing if she can be in the field to now experiencing the favor of the owner and being able to go and take food back that her mother in law can eat in that moment, as well as the first fruits of a future hope. And so Ruth comes off incredibly well in this text. She is humble, she's industrious, she's hardworking. And now in verse 19, her mother in law can't believe it. Naomi says, "Where did you gather barley today? And where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." And Brian, as we said at the beginning, I just want to note again, please, every time there's a blessing, I just invite our readers, consider how is that blessing working in terms of mechanistically in the story itself to bring about the desired end. When Naomi blesses Boaz, the man who noticed her, Boaz is
Hmm.
indeed going to be blessed. And she says it again in verse 20. May the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. These blessings really seem to be the catalyst of God's movement behind the scenes, of God working this out. But Naomi here, it's like she goes from despondency and darkness to now the glimmer of hope, the spark of hope being lit in her heart. And all of a sudden it fans into flame. She thinks, I'm no longer abandoned by God. Maybe God is the God who sees me. Maybe God does actually care for me. And so Ruth explains to her in verse 19, the name of the man I work with today is Boaz. Now think of this. Boaz knows who Naomi is. Boaz knows his connection to her. Naomi knows who Boaz is. And Naomi knows Boaz's connection to them. But Ruth doesn't. And
Yep.
that's what makes this even more beautiful is Ruth has no idea. All she knows is that God has been faithful and has truly taken her under his wings. But now Ruth is going to come to know because Naomi's, the light in her eyes comes up and he says, may the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. And to me, Brian, in that verse 20 especially, we see this this continued honor game, or we see this awareness
Hmm.
of honor that Naomi looks to Boaz and she recognizes he could have essentially shunned Ruth rather than taken her in. And in a sense, that might have been saving face. Elimelech and your husband, they left us, they abandoned us, and therefore we are going to treat you with dishonor. But instead, Boaz says, no, I'm going to show kindness to you. And Naomi is moved by this. I think that's what's behind her saying he has not abandoned his kindness to the living and the dead. She's considering her situation, but now she's considering it in a new light. So, Brian, what are some things you see here as Naomi responds to Boaz's kindness?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Tim. She recognizes that Boaz's response was not something you could necessarily guarantee would happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's important, listeners. We've stressed that we need to read the Old Testament as real stories, right? As real people, as adults, not as kids. These aren't people hovering above the ground with halos. Put yourself in a small town. One side of the family, one branch of the family left when times got hard.
Mm-hmm.
Now just the widow and a daughter-in-law have returned. Do you think Elimelech and his memory are in high favor? Wouldn't it maybe be better, as Tim said, for Boaz to just kind of we'll write them off, right? That's the weird side of the family. Those are the unbelievers that didn't trust in God's promises. I
Mm-hmm.
trusted in God, and look at how much I've been blessed. Couldn't we see it playing out that way? But instead, Boaz and Naomi recognizes it has shown grace and faithfulness to the living and the dead. He has embraced them as they have come back. I think that's a beautiful testimony. It's also, right, Tim, a reversal. Naomi is now unrenaming herself. Remember, she renamed herself, even though she never calls herself that, as, right, I'm disfavored by God. But now she sees that God has blessed her, reversing that kind of decision from chapter 1. I also want to call out before we leave these verses, Tim. This is the last time that God's name is used in the book,
Mm-hmm.
right? When she says, may the Lord bless the man who took notice of you. And in reading and prepping for this episode, I came across this quote by Martha Moore Keish, and it really helped crystallize something I want us to think about, listeners. So let me read the quote and let's talk about it. Martha says, throughout this chapter, God's activity is visible only through the activity of the characters, especially through Boaz's generous hospitality to Ruth. It is not independent of human action, but glimpsed in the blessing that comes from a kind man who shows mercy to a vulnerable immigrant woman. This undercover activity of God may make it easier for us to connect with the story, because many of us likewise affirm that the activity of God is primarily in and through the human acts of others. One of the beautiful things I love about this story, and I think of a couple other stories, maybe Esther, the Bible doesn't always hit us over the head that God is working all things together for the good of those who love him. Sometimes it's trying to show that God's blessing is through our faithfulness, our participation, right, in his grace and mercy towards others. I think of a song growing up by Reliant K. Ooh, I don't know if it was Reliant K. I want to be your hands. I want to be your feet. I don't think it was Reliant K. And I'm blanking on which band it was. Tim, do you know
I
which
do
song I'm
not know.
referencing? That's
Yeah.
fine. It was a bad reference, apparently. But the point being that we are often the tangible act and tangible representative of God's love in other people's lives. That's what Boaz is to Ruth. And I want us to not miss that. The author absolutely is trying to focus on God being present in the life of his people, but the author is doing so by drawing from the fact that, look, we see that best when we love God and use that love to bless those around us. It's an
Mhm.
important point because I think that's a very real life example. I feel the love of God sometimes most easily when I
Mhm.
see his people loving and caring for me.
Mhm.
And it's just a beautiful reminder of where this book rests kind of in the redemptive history of God.
Yeah.
I think, Tim, as we reach the end of this chapter, it ends with an implied question for us as readers, right?
Mhm.
What is the relationship in our lives and in the story we're reading between human action and divine action? God never speaks. I mentioned this already, but he never speaks in the book. He's only referenced. We talked in the very first episode, Tim, of when is this book set, or rather, when was this book written? Because we know when it's set. It's set in the time of Judges. I think generally this is set against an Ezra Nehemiah background. And
Mhm.
here's one of the reasons why. That was a time when people had been sent off into captivity and are just now coming back. They don't feel blessed by God. They are wondering, where is God in the midst of all this pain and suffering and loss? How do we know if God is present in our lives? And I think we see this beautiful reminder of God's blessing in the midst of pain. What did
Mhm.
Naomi say, Tim? God, we've seen blessings to the living and the dead. There's
Mhm.
still a reminder, even as we've reached this high point, right? There is real loss and real pain that has been suffered by these characters. Tragedy is not removed by seeing these blessings, but rather we can find new life even as we grieve for the dead.
Mhm.
And so I see that as kind of an important point and a question being driven to us as readers. How do we see this in our lives? How do we relate to these characters and
Mhm.
find God's presence in our lives amidst pain? So I see some of these beautiful questions kind of being surfaced as we end this chapter. And in the next chapter, we're going to pick up the resolution of some of that and also where we go with the Boaz and Ruth dynamic. Tim, before we leave chapter 2 and the halfway point of this book, what are some final thoughts you have for our listeners?
Yeah, well, just one final thought. We see Ruth, she receives the advice of her mother in law. She stays in the field of Boaz until the end of the harvest. And again, we see this speed of one day that takes up really an entire chapter. And then we see maybe several days or weeks even that take up just a few verses. But Brian, I came across something this week that I had never really thought about. I'm just exploring it in my mind. And so I'll explore it out loud with our listeners. I was reading Matthew chapter 1, which of course famously includes Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus. But as I was reading it, I noticed it says that Boaz's mother was Rahab. And the implication is that that was Rahab, as in the same Rahab that shows up in the Joshua narrative. Now, as we think about that possibility, I love what you say about Naomi and Ruth. Both of them are working through the experiences that they have had, the loss, the grief. And I can't help but wonder if it's true that Rahab was Boaz's mother. Perhaps whenever he sees this vulnerable woman who is not an Israelite, who has no claim on the covenant grace of God, maybe one of the reasons why he offers and sees grace toward Ruth is because he knows the story of his own mother. He
Mm.
understands that perhaps she was one who felt the same kind of vulnerability as someone who had to be grafted into the people of God. And so, as we think about Boaz, we don't know exactly what it was that shaped his godly character. And yet, there are some hints. That doesn't come itself in Ruth chapter 2, but we do see it later on in Matthew. And but whatever it is, I think we can take this as an application for ourselves. We should desire God to form his likeness in us so that when we see people who are similarly vulnerable, we have the kind of eyes that see them and who show the same kind of generosity that Boaz did. For our lives, it's just easy to get stuck in our own rhythms and really thinking about our own issues or our own problems. But at least for me, as I was reading this chapter, the Lord just impressed on me, I want to be as generous as Boaz was, even to those who, for Boaz, he had no thought that he would ever be paid back for his kindness. He simply showed it because God had worked that character in his heart. A beautiful story, and I look forward to chapter 3, Brian.
Such beautiful thoughts, Tim. We are to be known as the disciples of Christ by our love for one another. And I think we see here, as you point out, there's a great example of how love can be magnanimous, how can it go beyond cultural expectations and norms. And that catches people's attention. And that makes people go, what is different? What is happening in this story? So excellent thoughts. Listeners, we hope that this episode has helped you as we've gone through the end of chapter 2. Join us next week as we move into the back half of the book of Ruth and we start developing the courting relationship of Boaz and Ruth. We'll maybe make him just a little less ruthless. Anyway, that's for next time. We hope that you have a wonderful week. And until next time, stay cool and stay old.